A little girl's small finger pointed across the room. For words left her mouth. And the man worth $2 billion felt the floor disappear beneath him. That's my mommy's ring. Nobody at the engagement dinner moved. Forks froze in midair. Champagne glasses stopped halfway to lips. Daniel Cross, 32 years old, the man about to marry into one of the wealthiest families in the country, looked down at his fiancée's hand. At the very ring his future stepfather-in-law, billionaire Richard Whitfield, had personally selected from a vault in Geneva. The toddler's mother, the housemaid quietly clearing dessert plates, dropped a glass. It shattered against the marble floor. Richard Whitfield, 40 years old, the man whose name was on 3 skyscrapers and whose signature controlled half a shipping empire, did not look at the broken glass. He looked at the child. And his face, the face that had stared down hostile takeovers and congressional hearings without flinching, went the color of bone. 3 weeks earlier, nobody would have predicted any of this. Daniel Cross had built his life with precision, the same way he built his contracts, clause by clause with no room for ambiguity. He was a corporate lawyer, sharp enough to make partners twice his age nervous, careful enough that his colleagues joked he read NDAs in his sleep. He didn't believe in accidents. He believed in patterns, in evidence, in things that could be proven. Which was why the wedding to Vivian Whitfield made sense on paper. She was beautiful, composed, the daughter of a man who could buy entire industries. Their courtship had been short, 8 months, but efficient the way Daniel liked things. 2 people who understood each other's worlds. No surprises. He told himself that every night, lying beside her in the Whitfield penthouse, staring at the ceiling. No surprises. The maid, Sienna Mercer, had worked for the Whitfield family for just over a year. She was 26, quiet, careful in the way people are when they've learned that being noticed rarely brings anything good. She kept to herself. She did her work well. And she had a daughter, a 3-year-old named Lily, with dark curls and an unsettling habit of staring at people a beat too long, as if she were studying them. Daniel had met Lily exactly twice before that dinner. Once in the hallway, when she'd dropped a stuffed rabbit and he'd picked it up for her. Once in the kitchen when she'd looked up at him and said simply, "You smell like my mommy's old house." He'd laughed it off then. Kids said strange things. He wasn't laughing now. Tonight was the engagement dinner. Small by Whitfield standards, only 40 guests, though 40 guests at a Whitfield event still meant a string quartet and a guest list that read like a Forbes index. Richard Whitfield stood at the head of the table, raising a toast to his daughter and the man who would soon be family. "To Vivian," Richard said. His voice steady, practiced, the voice of a man who had given 1,000 toasts. "And to Daniel. May your marriage be built on something stronger than money. May it be built on trust." Daniel noticed, even then, the faint hesitation before the word trust. A half-second pause. He filed it away the way he filed away everything, without quite knowing why it mattered yet. Sienna moved along the edges of the room with a tray, refilling water glasses, silent and efficient. Lily sat at a small table near the kitchen door, swinging her legs, half watching a tablet, half watching the room. Then Vivian raised her hand to brush her hair back, and the candlelight caught her engagement ring. A deep blue sapphire surrounded by a halo of diamonds, unusual, old-fashioned in its setting, the kind of piece that looked like it belonged in a different decade. Lily's head turned. Slowly, deliberately. She slid off her chair, walked straight across the dining room, past startled guests, past her mother who reached for her too late, and stopped directly in front of Vivian. He pointed. "That's my mommy's ring." The room went silent. Vivian laughed first, a brittle, confused sound. "I'm sorry, what?" But nobody was looking at Vivian anymore. They were looking at Richard Whitfield, who had risen halfway out of his chair, one hand braced against the table, his knuckles white. "Lily," Sienna said quickly, rushing forward, scooping her daughter up. "I'm so sorry she gets confused, she doesn't." Sit down, Sienna. Richard's voice came out low, controlled. But Daniel had spent a decade reading people for a living, and he heard what was underneath that control. Fear. The dinner ended early. Guests were ushered out with apologies about a family matter. Daniel watched it all from across the room, his mind already working through the only thing it knew how to do: find the pattern, find the truth. That night Daniel couldn't sleep. Vivian lay beside him, scrolling through her phone, unbothered. "She's 3, Vivian said, not looking up. She probably saw a similar ring in a cartoon. It's a custom setting, Daniel said quietly. Your father had it made. There isn't another one like it. Vivian finally looked at him. What are you saying? I'm not saying anything. I'm asking a question. He sat up. Why did your father look like he'd seen a ghost? Vivian's jaw tightened. The same tell she had when negotiating with her own father over allowance for charity galas. He didn't look like anything. You're imagining things. But Daniel wasn't imagining things. He had built his entire career on the ability to notice what others missed. And what he had noticed, in the half-second before Richard Whitfield composed himself, was something he recognized from 100 depositions: guilt. He lay back down, staring at the ceiling again. No surprises, he reminded himself. The lie felt heavier this time. The next morning, Daniel went looking for answers in the only way he knew how. Quietly, methodically, without alerting anyone to what he was doing. He started with the ring. He knew a jeweler, an old family friend who'd done appraisal work for half the families in the city. Daniel sent him a photo from the engagement dinner, taken on his phone, claiming he wanted insurance documentation. The jeweler called back within the hour. This is a strange one, the man said. I actually remember this piece. Or one very much like it. We don't make settings like this anymore. The halo cut, the color grading on that sapphire. I appraised something almost identical maybe 4 years ago. Private client. Do you remember the name? Oz. I'd have to check the records. But Daniel, why are you asking about an insurance appraisal like it's a case file? Daniel didn't answer that. He went to the Whitfield estate that afternoon under the excuse of returning a borrowed pen, the kind of flimsy reason that would have embarrassed him in any other context. He found Sienna in the laundry room, folding linens, Lily asleep on a small cot in the corner. Can I ask you something? Daniel said. Sienna's shoulders tensed before she even turned around. I already apologized to Mr. Whitfield. Lily doesn't usually. I'm not here about an apology. Daniel kept his voice gentle, the tone he used with nervous witnesses. I want to know what she meant. Sienna's hands stilled on the linen. She's 3 years old. Kids say things. That ring is a custom piece. There's only one like it in the world. Your daughter recognized it on sight. He took a step closer, careful, non-threatening. I'm not trying to cause trouble for you. I just need to understand what's happening in my own life before I marry into it. For a long moment Sienna said nothing. Then quietly, you should ask Mr. Whitfield. Not me. It's not my place. Sienna, please. Her voice cracked slightly. I need this job. I have a daughter to take care of. I can't. She stopped herself, glancing at the sleeping child. Please don't make me say anything. There it was again. Fear. The same fear he'd seen on Richard Whitfield's face the night before, except this time it belonged to someone with far less power to lose. Daniel left without pushing further, but he didn't go far. He sat in his car at the end of the long gravel driveway, engine off, watching the staff cottage through the rearview mirror. He told himself he was waiting for something. A sign, a piece of evidence, anything concrete to hold on to. In truth, he was stalling because some part of him already understood that once he learned the answer, he would never be able to go back to not knowing it. His phone buzzed. The jeweler. I found the record, the man said. The piece I appraised 4 years ago. The buyer's name was Richard Whitfield. But here's the part you're going to want to sit down for. It wasn't purchased for your fiancé. The order specified the ring was for his wife. Daniel stopped walking. His wife died 6 years ago. That's what I thought too. Which is why I called instead of emailing. The jeweler's voice dropped. Daniel, the order was placed 4 years ago. 2 years after she passed. Daniel stood in the driveway of the Whitfield estate, the late afternoon sun throwing long shadows across the gravel, and felt something cold settle into his chest. 2 years after his wife's death, Richard Whitfield had commissioned a ring for a woman who wasn't dead at all. He didn't go home that evening. Instead, he drove to the public library branch near his old law school, the one with the microfiche archives nobody used anymore except researchers and people like him who needed records that hadn't made it onto the internet. He pulled the Whitfield Foundation's gala guest lists from 4 and 5 years back, cross-referencing them against staff hiring records he'd glimpsed once during a contract review for the estate's household management company. It took him almost 2 hours, but he found something. A name buried in a vendor invoice from a catering company the foundation had used for a private fundraiser 5 years earlier. Mercer server staff, temporary contract. The same year, by his calculation, that the affair would have had to begin if the math on the ring and the pregnancy lined up the way he feared it might. He sat in the library's fluorescent quiet, the printout in his hands, and felt the particular dread of a lawyer who has just found the document that breaks his own case wide open. Except this time, the case was his own life. He thought about calling Vivian. He didn't. Instead, he folded the paper, put it in his jacket pocket, and drove to a bar 3 blocks from his apartment, where he sat alone for 2 hours before his phone rang. "Where are you?" Her voice was tight. "Working late. My father wants to see you. Tomorrow morning." He said it's important. Daniel's pulse quickened. Did he say what about? Pause longer than it should have been. No. But Daniel, whatever this is, please be careful. I don't know what's going on, but I've never seen him like this. For the first time since they'd gotten engaged, Daniel heard something in Vivian's voice that sounded almost like fear of her own father. He hung up and sat in the dark a while longer, staring at nothing, the pieces refusing to fit together yet, but close. So close he could feel the shape of the truth even without seeing it. Richard Whitfield's office occupied the top floor of a building that bore his name. Daniel had been there a dozen times before. For contract reviews, for family gatherings disguised as business meetings, for the kind of quiet conversations rich men had when they wanted something handled discreetly. This time felt different. Richard sat behind his desk, and for the first time since Daniel had known him, the man looked old. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "Sit down, Daniel." Daniel sat. "I assume," Richard said slowly, "that you've been asking questions." "I have. And what have you found?" Daniel decided there was no point in pretending otherwise. "A ring commissioned 4 years ago. For a woman you called your wife. 2 years after Eleanor died." Richard's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. He stood, walked to the window, looked out over the city skyline he had spent 30 years building. "Eleanor and I had a difficult marriage," he said finally. "Not unhappy, difficult. There's a difference few people understand until they've lived it. We loved each other in the way 2 people who built an empire together love each other. Out of respect. Out of habit. Not out of passion." "That's not an answer to my question." "I'm getting there." Richard turned. 6 years ago, when Eleanor was diagnosed, I made a choice I'm not proud of. I withdrew. I couldn't watch her disappear, so I found somewhere else to put what I couldn't face. Daniel's stomach turned cold. "You had an affair while your wife was dying." "It wasn't." Richard stopped, exhaled. "It became something more than that. After Eleanor passed, it continued. Quietly. I commissioned that ring because I intended to marry again. Privately. Away from the press, away from Vivian, away from the Foundation's image. I wanted to give this woman the life I felt I owed her. What happened? Richard's hands, normally so steady in board meetings, trembled slightly against the windowsill. She disappeared. 4 years ago. No note. No warning. I searched for months. Quietly. Because I couldn't exactly hire investigators without questions being asked about a relationship the world didn't know existed. Eventually I told myself she'd taken the money I'd given her and started a new life somewhere I'd never find her. Daniel felt the shape of the truth sharpening, the edges becoming visible. "Richard," he said carefully, "how old would her child be now if she'd been pregnant when she left?" Richard didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence in the room was its own confession. "Sienna," Daniel said. Richard closed his eyes. "I didn't know," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "When she applied for the housekeeping position 14 months ago, I was in Singapore for the merger. My estate manager hired her. I didn't see the name on the paperwork until she'd already started. By then..." He shook his head. "By then I told myself it had to be a coincidence. Different Sienna. There are thousands of women with that name." "But you knew," Daniel said. "The moment you saw her you knew." Richard's silence confirmed it. "Why didn't you say anything? Confront her? Help her?" "Because if I acknowledged her, acknowledged the child, everything would unravel. The Foundation, Vivian's trust fund, which is tied to Eleanor's estate and contains clauses about infidelity that would void half of it. My reputation. The wedding. Everything I built to survive Eleanor's death and protect what was left of this family." Richard's voice cracked just slightly. "I told myself I would find a quiet way to provide for them without anyone knowing. I increased her salary without explanation. I made sure she had benefits no other staff received. I thought that was enough." "That's not enough, Richard. That's a man buying his own silence. I know what it looks like." "It's not what it looks like. It's what it is." Daniel stood, his hands shaking now too, though from a different emotion entirely, something closer to disgust. "You let a woman raise your child in your house, cleaning your floors, while you sat at dinner tables pretending she didn't exist. What would you have me do, Daniel?" Richard's composure finally cracked fully, his voice rising. "Tell my daughter, 3 weeks before her wedding, that her father has a secret child with the housekeeper? Destroy everything Vivian has ever believed about her family in one conversation? I think," Daniel said quietly, "you're more worried about destroying yourself than destroying her." The words landed like a slap. Richard sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately, because the truth was he didn't know. Vivian was his fiancée. Sienna and Lily were innocent in all of this. A woman who had been left behind, a child who had grown up without a father who lived under the same roof and chose to look away. And somewhere in the middle of it all was Daniel himself, a man who had built his entire identity around precision and truth, now standing in the wreckage of a secret that would reshape everyone's lives the moment it surfaced. "I'm going to talk to Sienna," he said finally. "She deserves to know that you know. And Lily deserves a father who isn't a stranger in her own home. And Vivian." Daniel looked at the man who was about to become, or perhaps never become, his father-in-law. "That's your conversation to have, not mine. I won't lie to her, Richard. But I won't be the one to break her heart for you either. You've hidden behind other people's silence long enough." Daniel found Sienna in the small staff cottage behind the main house, Lily curled up asleep beside her on a worn couch, a cartoon playing quietly on an old television. Sienna's eyes were red-rimmed when she opened the door, as if she already knew what conversation was coming. "He told me you'd figured it out," she said. "He told me everything." She let him in, careful not to wake Lily, gesturing him toward a small kitchen table. Her hands wrapped around a mug of cold tea she clearly hadn't been drinking. "I never meant to come back into his life," she said. "I didn't even know this estate belonged to him when I applied. I needed a job that paid better than the diner, somewhere with housing included so Lily could have her own room instead of sharing a one-bedroom with 3 other families. The agency placed me here. By the time I realized whose house it was, I'd already signed the contract, and I couldn't afford to walk away." "Why did you leave 4 years ago? Before any of this?" Sienna's eyes filled. "Because he made promises he never intended to keep. The ring, the apartment he talked about, the future. All of it was real to him only as long as Eleanor wasn't in the room to see it. The moment she got sick, I became something he was ashamed of. I didn't want my daughter growing up as someone's secret. So I left. I found out I was pregnant 2 months later, and I never told him. I built a life without his money, without his name. I was doing fine. Until you ended up working in his house." "Until I ended up working in his house," she agreed quietly. "I told myself I'd stay quiet. Take the salary, save enough to move somewhere else, somewhere far from this family. I never expected Lily to recognize that ring. She must have seen a photo once, in an old box of things I kept and stupidly didn't hide well enough." She wiped her eyes. "She's smarter than any 3-year-old should be." Daniel looked toward the sleeping child, dark curls splayed across the couch cushion, one small hand still clutching a stuffed rabbit, the same one he'd picked up off the hallway floor weeks ago. "What do you want, Sienna? Not what you think you deserve. What do you actually want?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I want my daughter to know who her father is," she said finally. "Not for the money. Not for the name. Just so she stops asking me why she doesn't have one, the way every other kid in her daycare does." The next 2 weeks moved like a held breath. Daniel returned to the penthouse each night and said nothing to Vivian, not out of loyalty to Richard, but because he understood now that this truth wasn't his to deliver. It belonged to a father and a daughter, and no matter how compromised Richard Whitfield's choices had been, Daniel believed, for reasons he couldn't fully explain even to himself, that the man deserved the chance to tell his own daughter the truth, rather than have it handed to her secondhand by the man she was about to marry. But the silence cost him. He watched Vivian across the breakfast table, noticed things he'd never noticed before, the way she sometimes spoke about her mother with a brittleness that suggested old, unhealed grief, the way she'd once mentioned offhand that her father had been different in the 2 years after Eleanor's diagnosis, distant in a way she'd never understood. She had no idea how much of her own history was sitting 3 doors down the hallway, asleep on a staff cottage couch. Richard, for his part, seemed to be unraveling in slow motion. Daniel saw him twice that week, each time looking more hollowed out than the last. On the 3rd occasion, Richard asked him to stay after a brief business meeting. "I'm going to tell her," Richard said. "Vivian. Everything." "When?" "I don't know how to choose a when for something like this." Richard rubbed his temples. "I keep rehearsing it in my head and every version sounds worse than the last." "There isn't a version that sounds good, Richard. That's the nature of the truth you buried." Daniel paused. "But there's a difference between telling her and being caught. You still have the chance to be the one who tells her. That window is closing fast." "Closing how?" Daniel hesitated, then decided honesty was the only currency he had left in this whole situation. "Sienna wants Lily to know her father. That's not a threat, Richard. That's a mother trying to do right by her daughter. But it means this isn't staying quiet much longer, with or without your help." Later that week, Daniel found himself back at the staff cottage, not because he had any business there, but because Sienna had called him, her voice tight with worry. "Lily asked me today why the old man in the big house never plays with her," Sienna said when Daniel arrived. "She doesn't know who he is. She just knows he's there, and that he watches her sometimes from the window, and that the other kids in her daycare have a grandpa who visits and she doesn't. Daniel sat across from her at the small kitchen table, the same one where he'd first heard the truth. What did you tell her? I told her some grown-ups are shy. Sienna laughed, but there was no humor in it. She's 3. She's going to need a better answer than that eventually, and I'm running out of time to come up with one. He's going to tell Vivian. Soon. And then what? Then everyone knows. And nothing changes for Lily except that she becomes the subject of gossip at every charity dinner for the next decade. Sienna's voice cracked. I didn't come back here for this. I came back because the paycheck was good and the room had a window. I never wanted my daughter's existence to be a scandal. She won't be a scandal, Daniel said with more certainty than he felt. She'll be a sister, daughter, family. It might take time for everyone to see her that way instead of as a complication, but I don't think you give Richard enough credit for what he's capable of, once he stops being a coward about it. Sienna studied him for a long moment. You really believe that? I have to, Daniel said quietly. Because I'm about to marry into this family, and I need to believe it's still a family worth marrying into. Richard nodded slowly, something resigned settling over his features. Not quite peace, but the closest thing to it he'd shown since the dinner. There's something else, he said. Something I haven't told you or Sienna or anyone. Daniel waited. Eleanor knew. The words hit harder than Daniel expected. What? Near the end. She found a letter I'd written to Sienna and never sent. One of those things you write in grief and guilt and never have the courage to mail. Eleanor read it 3 weeks before she died. Richard's voice broke for the first time, genuinely, the practiced control of decades finally giving way. She didn't yell. She didn't even cry, not in front of me. She just asked me one question. Does she make you happy the way I couldn't at the end? I didn't answer her. Couldn't. And she died never hearing me say yes or no. Daniel sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling over the room. She left something for you to find eventually, Richard continued. A letter of her own. My lawyer has held it in a sealed file for 6 years, per her instructions, to be opened only if and when the truth about Sienna ever came to light within the family. I think, he said quietly, that time has come. The letter was opened 3 days later, in the presence of Richard, Daniel, and the family attorney, a formality Richard insisted on, perhaps because he no longer trusted himself to interpret his late wife's final wishes without a witness. Eleanor's handwriting was elegant, steady, written by a woman who had clearly known her time was running out and had used what strength she had left with purpose. Richard, if you're reading this, then the truth has finally found its way to the surface, as truths eventually do. I want you to know that I am not writing this in anger. I made my peace with our marriage's shortcomings long before I made peace with my diagnosis. If there is a child, and I suspect in my heart that there may one day be one, I want them to know they are not a mistake, not a secret to be ashamed of, and not a debt to be quietly paid off. I want them included. Not as an afterthought, Richard, but as family. I am leaving a portion of my personal trust, separate from the foundation, separate from anything tied to Vivian's inheritance, to be divided equally between any children you may have, acknowledged or not. My lawyer has the details. Do right by them, Richard. It is the last thing I will ever ask of you, and it is the only thing that matters now. Eleanor. The room was silent when Richard finished reading aloud, his voice unsteady through the final lines. Daniel watched the man, a billionaire, a titan of industry, untouchable in every boardroom he'd ever entered, sit utterly undone by the generosity of a wife he had betrayed. She knew, Richard whispered. She knew, and she still. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Vivian found out 2 days later, not from a confrontation or an accusation, but from her father sitting her down in his study and, for the first time in her adult life, telling her the truth without softening a single edge of it. Daniel wasn't in the room for that conversation. He waited outside in the long hallway lined with portraits of Whitfield ancestors, listening to muffled voices rise and fall and eventually break into something that sounded like crying, though whose he couldn't tell. When Vivian finally emerged, her eyes were swollen, her composure, the same composure she'd inherited from her father, cracked wide open. "Did you know?" she asked Daniel. "This whole time did you know and say nothing?" "I found out 2 weeks ago," Daniel said honestly. "I told your father I wouldn't be the one to tell you. I thought you deserved to hear it from him." Vivian stared at him for a long moment, anger and grief warring across her face. "That's not your call to make, Daniel. We're supposed to be getting married. We're not supposed to have secrets like this between us." "You're right," Daniel said quietly. "And I'm sorry for the 2 weeks of silence. But this was never my secret to tell. It was his. The only thing I could control was making sure he didn't get to bury it forever." Vivian wiped her face, looking suddenly very young, very lost. "I have a sister. I'm 28 years old and I just found out I have a 3-year-old sister I never knew existed." "You do? What is she like?" Daniel allowed himself, for the first time in this entire ordeal, something close to a smile. "She's sharp, observant." She noticed a custom ring setting from across a crowded room and connected it to a memory most adults wouldn't have caught. "She's going to run circles around all of us by the time she's 10. A small, broken laugh escaped Vivian, somewhere between a sob and genuine amusement. "God help us." She didn't go straight home that night. Instead, she asked Daniel to drive her to the staff cottage, something neither of them had planned and both of them understood couldn't wait. She stood outside the door for almost a full minute before knocking, and when Sienna opened it, the two women simply looked at each other. One raised in marble hallways, the other in a one-bedroom apartment shared between 3 families, both of them now bound together by a child neither had asked to be the reason for. "I don't know what to say to you," Vivian admitted. "You don't have to say anything," Sienna replied. "She's the one who matters." Lily appeared in the doorway behind her mother, peering up at the strange, beautifully dressed woman with the same unflinching curiosity she'd once aimed at a sapphire ring. "Are you my sister?" Lily asked, no hesitation in her voice at all, as if the question were no larger than asking about the weather. Vivian crouched down, her composure finally breaking into something soft. "I think I am." "Okay," Lily said, satisfied, and held up her stuffed rabbit for inspection, already moving on to more important matters. Vivian laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks, and Daniel, watching from the doorway, felt something in his chest loosen for the first time since the night of the dinner. The reconciliation, when it came, was neither instant nor clean. Vivian needed weeks to process the betrayal, not just her father's affair, but the years of careful omission, the lie of a perfect family she'd been raised inside without ever questioning its foundation. She was furious with Richard in a way that took most of a month to soften into something resembling forgiveness, and even then, it was forgiveness with conditions. Therapy, transparency, an actual relationship with Lily built slowly and on the child's terms, not Richard's convenience. Sienna, for her part, was offered something she hadn't dared to ask for outright. Not charity, not a payoff, but acknowledgement. Richard set up a trust for Lily independent of the family's holding structure, per Eleanor's final wishes, ensuring the money could never be used as leverage or later disputed by anyone protecting their own inheritance. He didn't ask Sienna to quit her job, and to her credit, she didn't immediately accept a life of leisure either. She stayed on for another 2 months on her own terms, before transitioning into running a small bakery Eleanor's trust quietly financed, the kind of dream she'd shelved the day she found out she was pregnant and alone. Lily got something rarer than money. She got a father who, however late and however imperfectly, finally showed up, not as a stranger passing her in hallways, but as someone who picked her up from daycare on Tuesdays, who sat through her favorite cartoons even when board meetings were waiting, who learned, slowly, how to be present in a way his wealth had never required of him before. As for Daniel and Vivian, The wedding didn't happen on its original date. They postponed it by 6 months, not because the relationship had broken beyond repair, but because both of them needed time to rebuild trust on terms that had nothing to do with contracts or careful negotiation. When they finally did marry, it was a smaller ceremony than originally planned, with far fewer guests and far more honesty. Lily was the flower girl. 4 years old by then, dark curls bouncing as she walked down the aisle, scattering petals with the same fierce concentration she'd once aimed at a sapphire ring across a crowded dinner table. Afterward, at the reception, she tugged on Daniel's sleeve and looked up at him with the same unsettling directness she'd had since the day he met her. "You're my brother now," she announced. Not a question. A fact, delivered the way only a child could deliver it. Absolute and unshakable. Daniel crouched down to her level. "I guess I am." "Good," she said simply, and ran off toward the dance floor, leaving him kneeling there, struck by how a single sentence from a 3-year-old had unraveled a carefully built world of secrets, and somehow, against every odd, left something more honest standing in its place.